Once you can find those pieces of connection, you can, start to expand the conversation into larger topics. And that's what I hope this film can show to people, that, climate change is not a single button issue topic, but it involves so many different things. And that hopefully the more conversations we have, things like climate change will just start to show up in everyday conversation. The more we talk about it, then hopefully the more we'll do about it too.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. The Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway is a unique body of water on the east coast of the United States. If you were in Miami, Florida right now, you could hop in a boat and travel 1,000 miles on the Intracoastal Waterway, all the way up to Norfolk, Virginia. In 2020, Will Freund set out to make that journey alone in a kayak, a 16-foot sailing kayak. He made the journey in order to talk with people in coastal communities and hear their thoughts about climate change. Will is our guest for this week's episode of Creating a Cooler World. Will was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but has lived in the southeastern U.S. for most of his life. He graduated from the College of Charleston with a degree in biology and has done a variety of conservation and environmental education work that's brought him to many parts of the East Coast, from Sarasota, Florida to Corolla, North Carolina, and everywhere in between. Will is first and foremost a storyteller with a passion for education, the environment, and making something from nothing. He currently works at the University of North Carolina's Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. And on the side, he produces independent climate change documentary films. Welcome, Will. It's awesome to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm very interested in hearing some of the details behind this kayak journey that you went on. And I've seen your documentary, and I encourage anybody to watch that, Connected by Water, if you have the time. Super interesting. Hopefully that people who haven't seen your documentary, who listen to this episode, will be interested in watching it. I thought it was great. For the people who haven't seen it, just kind of set the scene for this. So you did a 1,000-mile journey up the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway solo in a sailing kayak. And first, for anybody who might not know, could you just describe, what is the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite exciting things to talk about, because it's really kind of like a hidden gem, in my opinion, when it comes to the Outer Banks and, the coast of Florida, and really anywhere along the east coast of the United States. That, when you go out to the beach, you drive over that bridge to get out to the beach, and you might see a little sign that says Intercoastal Waterway, or you might even see a sign at all, and it looks like this is a small river. But that really is a connected waterway that connects, the entire east coast of the United States with an unbroken waterway. And so the Intercoastal Waterway itself, dates back hundreds of years. It is made up of man-made channels and canals, but it's also, sounds and bays and rivers. And it's also, it doesn't flow in one direction. You're going behind islands, you're going up sounds and bays. And so you have tides to deal with. And so, the water is constantly moving up and down, at different tide levels. It might be up 8 feet one day and then down 4 feet in another location another day. Going back to the founding of our country, it was, used as a form of transportation for goods, but then also a defense mechanism for, when in war times, that it was a protected waterway. And so now it's very much mostly used recreationally, because a lot of the commercial vessels are too big to go up and down the Intercoastal Waterway. But it's a incredibly popular recreational use. And as of right now, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, at any spot on the Intercoastal Waterway, it should sit about 100 feet wide and 12 feet deep.
And the idea, if I understand it, is you can actually go up large portion of the East Coast without ever going out in the ocean if you're in a small enough vessel, right? That's the whole idea, is you're kind of on these inland, slightly inland waterways just in from the beach. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. The only time that if you take the Intercoastal Waterway, like I did for my trip from Miami, Florida to Norfolk, Virginia, the only times that you don't have land on both sides is when you're going across an ocean inlet. Whether that's like here in North Carolina, going like across Hatteras Inlet or Ocracoke Inlet, or further south, basically anywhere when you have a gap between two islands, you have that inlet. That's the only time you're going to have, land not on both sides of you.
You did this journey in a Hobie Adventure Island kayak. And for those people who might not be familiar, could you just briefly describe what a Hobie Adventure Island kayak is?
Yeah, I like to think that it is a kayak on steroids, in that, the base kayak itself, the center part is a basic kayak. It's got that long, narrow shape. But the extra parts of the Hobie Adventure Island, and they have a two-seater version of a tandem island, but they're basically the same. That then, in addition to the single center kayak, it also has two kind of floater pontoons on the outside, about 3 feet on each side, that then have trampolines on the side. So it looks more like a trimaran, like a 3-hole. But you really just sit in the center, and the two outriggers are for stability more than anything. Because then at the front is then a sail, and the sail stands another 17 feet up off the center of the boat. And so, but then, it has elements of a sailboat, that it has a dagger board to help stability. It has a rudder that you steer with your hand. But then also at the same time, it has pedals like a pedal kayak, but then it also has a spot for a paddle, like, your super basic kayak of just paddling with your hands. And so it's got a little bit of everything, and it's got lots of storage areas. And I've seen people I didn't use it for myself, but I've even seen people put small outboard motors on them as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to include like at least a link to a photo or a video, or, well, if people, I'm not even going to do that. I'm just going to encourage people to watch your video, your documentary, so they can see what this looks like, because they really are an interesting looking boat, and it's 16 feet long, right? The one that you,
Yep.
The one that you used. How long did this journey take? I know it was interrupted at one point, but the overall journey, like how many days were you out on the water, or weeks or months, doing this 1,000-mile journey in this sailing kayak?
Yeah, the total length of the journey time-wise is about 3.5 months, or about 100 days.
And so, and you're basically living on it, right? I know you got off every once in a while, but there were a lot of nights that you slept on board. You had it set up so you could actually like camp on this 16-foot kayak. Could you tell people a little bit about some of the customizations that you made?
Yeah, this was so much fun to try and figure it out, because one of the super fun things with the Hobie Adventure Island itself is it has an incredible community of people always trying to find creative ways of, solving problems that they have, or, thinking of creating creative ways of doing new things that are not traditionally used on a boat like this. And so for me, the main things that I was focused on was I needed to find a way to help film my trip. And then I also needed to have a way to sleep on the boat. And those were kind of the two biggest modifications that I did. And one of them was the more simple one I'll start with, is the filming mechanic, that there's actually lots of aftermarket companies that create basically boom pole mounts that you can then just bolt in, drill some holes in the hull and then put a boom arm in. And that was super helpful for me to be able to put on a GoPro and be hands-free with that, so that I could then sail the boat. But the big modification, the one that got a lot of attention in the Hobie Adventure Island circles, was I wanted to sleep on the boat. And there was a couple of people that had thought of a couple of different ways of doing it. And where a lot of the consensus was using what is called a cot tent. So, a standard cot, it's got a couple of legs and then kind of a rigid frame with some cloth in the center. And so this company that I used, Camprite, actually creates basically a cot with a tent built into it. And so I then would be able to just like unfold this tent, and I only had to worry about two legs on the ground. I didn't have to worry about, the flexible bottom of a tent or tent poles or anything like that. And so then the modification was to take basically some synthetic deck board that you would use like on your back deck, and bolt them to the support arms that went out to the supporting pontoons. The arms and pontoons were called amas and akas. But yeah, bolting things to the support bars to then allow the tent to sit on top of it. And then I would strap the tent down to the kayak so that I didn't have to, if I moved to one side of the tent or the other, the tent didn't tip one way or the other. And I was able to sleep on that on the boat. And those were some of the best nights that I slept. And even more so, you were talking about me going into marinas to, resupply and get new equipment or do laundry, shower, whatever might be there. I also was trying to figure out ways to anchor out with this boat. Traditionally, if you had larger boats, you would have, places to tie off a boat and places to set an anchor. And, it's all specifically designed to do that. Well, the Hobie Adventure Island is not designed to anchor out for long periods of time. They do have an anchor trolley that they build. That's more for like doing a slow drag of an anchor down a river, not like anchoring out in a sound overnight with someone sleeping on it. And so, I got to figure out some different ways of, how do I tie things off to make the anchor line go in the right direction so that the boat points in the right direction, and how do I tie it off so I don't break anything if weather gets bad. And that was really a learning process throughout the entire trip. That the first few times I did it, I had to wake up in the middle of the night and fix things, but definitely by the end of the trip, I was able to get the anchor set, get the tent set up, and feel pretty secure on the first try.
Watching the documentary, you can see how you have this tent and bed system set up. I didn't realize it was actually like a cot with a tent built into it, like an army cot or camping cot with the tent built on. It's really cool that you found that and were able to modify it for the boat.
Yeah, there's a whole Facebook community of owners that were always constantly trading ideas of, hey, I'm trying to do this. What do you guys think? And that's really where I got a lot of my ideas and also support for doing a lot of these modifications, because of the fact that I hadn't done a trip like this before. Having a community like that to, trade ideas and also get advice for people that had been using these boats for a long time and had done similar types of things was an absolute help when preparing for this trip.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's awesome to have that support, that kind of a community. How did you originally get the idea to do this?
So in a short, daydreaming is where it all started. And I feel like that is all where a lot of great ideas start, is daydreaming. But specifically, this idea originally started in the fall or winter of 2018, when I was a intern with the Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium in Sarasota, Florida, and I was doing manatee research, doing identification out in the rivers and sounds in coastal waterways in and around Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay. And when I was out there, I was out on the rivers and the Gulf Coast Inner Waterway about once a week, and spent a lot of time out there. And, it was really my first time spending a lot of time on a waterway like that, and got me thinking, well, what if I traveled the whole thing? The whole thing originally being, the Gulf Coast, from Texas all the way around Florida and up the East Coast of the United States. It's over 3,000 miles. The more I thought about that, was probably a little bit long for a big adventure. And I hadn't had a big adventure in a while. I'd done some sailing adventures in college, but it had been several years since I'd gone on a big adventure. And so I started talking around with family, passing this idea around at the Thanksgiving table, when we're seeing family at Christmas. And, people were like, this sounds like a cool idea, but like, how is this actually going to, manifest itself? And so then once I had kind of narrowed it down to I wanted to do the East Coast, I also started reaching out to some of my other friends who have done some major adventures. I've come from growing up in the Boy Scout community, and so there's lots of people that from my old Boy Scout troop, Troop 210 in Cary, North Carolina. Shout out to them. Of one of my friends, Tommy Freeman, who was a thru hiker of the Appalachian Trail, and I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I've got this idea. Can we come and chat and grab a beer and talk through it?" And he was, a real great opportunity of advice to think about doing a long trip and what are some of those challenges, both physically and also mentally. And that was a huge help. And once I kind of started to have enough of pieces to be like, all right, I think I've got what I need. That's when I then officially launched the kind of planning phases of the project. At that time was called Climate, Kayak, and Conversation. And that was in March of 2019.
Did you do a like a shakedown cruise? Did you do like a few days or a week camping trip or something on the kayak, just to make sure, after you had it all set up, just to make sure everything was the way you wanted it to be, or you were prepared for the trip?
Yeah, I did do it. I did do a shakedown trip, and I did the shakedown about a month and a half before I was slated to launch. So not a ton of time for modifications or any changes, but I did do a shakedown. And since it was February time, being in North Carolina, it's a little cold if I want to do any trips out here at that time. So I actually packed everything up and went down to where everything started, in Sarasota. And what I ended up doing is I started the trip technically in Tampa, and then spent 4 days traveling from Tampa, Florida, down to Sarasota, Florida, and was greeted at the end with the intern mentors that I'd had during my time at Marine Laboratory that were part of the team that helped inspire me to start the original project, which was a really fun kind of coming home moment for that.
Oh, very cool. When you announced that you were going to do this, or you shared this with people, I'm curious what friends, family, significant other, anybody, other people thought when you told them that you were going to do this trip.
There was definitely elements of surprise, of like, wow, that's a big trip. Are you sure you want to do that? But then also at the same time, a lot of people in my friends and family know that I like to challenge myself and, find unique challenges and adventures to go on. Whether it was me being a hang gliding instructor in college and, learning how to fly a hang glider by myself at 4,000 feet, and land safely back on the ground. Or in college, I did a study abroad program where I was on a crew that sailed a 130-foot sailboat from Puerto Rico to Bermuda to Cape Cod. And so I've got, tons of pelagic, I won't say a ton, but, pelagic sailing experience. But then also just generally growing up as a fairly adventurous lifestyle. And I appreciate my parents for kind of helping continue that passion forward. This was definitely the biggest project I'd ever taken on. But at the same time, they're like, no, we're not totally shocked that you decided to do something like this. And the fact that I was, announcing this with over a year of planning in advance, they're like, oh, okay, you're not like doing this tomorrow and have no idea what you're doing. And, that was appreciated, and really trying to focus on creating a project that was sustainable and achievable. And so, focusing on, not just the equipment that I needed, but the funds that I needed, the connections I needed to make, was a real part that was supported by a lot of my friends and family.
That's great. I would love for you to just talk people through a typical day. Like, so you're in this kayak, and it's, regular kayak. It has this outrigger pontoon on each side, and you have a sail. So when it's windy, you can sail. And I think, again, you get a little bit of a view of this in the documentary, but the unique thing about these Hobie kayaks is they have the pedal system, the Mirage drive, right? Where you're actually sitting there and pedaling with your feet, which drives these paddles underneath the kayak, which helps propel you. So it's almost like having a leg powered motor on the boat. As I watched the documentary, I was just curious about what a typical day would be like from the time you woke up in the morning until it's time to go to bed.
So I would say a typical day typical day we'll say of a travel day is, especially if I'm in a marina or anchoring out, I'm sleeping on the boat and wake up in the morning. And the wonderful thing about the sail part of this boat is the sail rolls up on itself. It's a furling sail, and so I have, once the sail's rolled up, I have lots of room to move about. But waking up, depending on whether how public of an area I'm in, will depend on, where things happen in the morning. But get up, do my brushing my teeth, all the things you normally do at home, brush my teeth, go to the bathroom, clean up my bed and pack away the tent, because the tent never stayed out. It got, set up and taken down every morning, because the tent basically sat where I would normally be sitting most times. And so, wake up, clean up, pack up the tent, and make breakfast. And breakfast was almost the same every single day. It was almost always oatmeal and coffee. And so I actually had a little pocket stove on board with me. And so I'd boil some water, and I actually acquired a taste over the 3 months for instant coffee, although I found that there are better instant coffees than others. And so I would make my breakfast, finish packing that up, and then usually as I'm doing my breakfast, I'm out in the world, but also at the same time, I'm not that far out in the middle of nowhere. I was in cell reception for, 99% of the trip. There's only a few hours in some of the areas that I didn't have cell phone signals. So, I was trying to stay up to date with things that were happening in the world. So I had a morning news that I would listen to. I would look over my routes for the day, see how far I'm going. I would look at the weather report. I would look at the wind report. I would look at the tide report, and kind of try to plan out my day. From there, once everything's packed up, I would then pull up the anchor or undock from the marina and kind of get on my way. And the big things to focus on the first part of the day is like, all right, what direction is the current moving? What time is high tide? What time is low tide? And, is the wind going to shift at any point today? And what is the strength? Because, going up the Intercoastal Waterway, as you're going along an island, you think about water flowing in the south end of the island and water flowing in on the north end of the island. That's creating two different currents in two different directions. And so as you transit the backside of an island, those currents will shift. And so, you're not always going to be able to 100% predict things, but, the more that you be in certain areas, the more likely you are to help predict them. So you're not fighting a really bad current. So, you're talking about, I've got the pedal system. And so, if I'm fighting a current, even if I have the wind with me, I might be pedaling, extra. And then even more so, if the wind's against me and the tide's against me, then I'm pedaling really hard. But generally on a travel day, I would say across the entire trip, I was probably sailing for 70% of the trip and pedaling for 30 of it, which I can chalk up to really good luck on the weather. And it was mostly because of the time of year that I was going, from basically mid to late March, April to late June, early July. The winds tend to be fairly favorable going north that time of year on the Intercoastal Waterway. And I never really stopped for lunch when I was out there. Lunch was usually just, meals throughout the day was just snacks, usually high protein, high calorie snacks, because, I'm out there all day. I was averaging, when I did my calculations, burning between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day. And so, I could basically eat whatever I wanted, which was great. And, then I would try and figure out what my next stop was. And, if it was good weather that day, do I try and push a little bit further, or do I have a specific place that I need to stop? Whether that's a specific marina that has a mail drop for me, I worked with my parents to help, have things shipped to me, whether it's a new piece of equipment or, some new clothes that have worn out or whatever it might be. Or if I'm meeting up with someone to do an interview with them or to do some filming, it kind of varied day by day. But generally it was, I tended to be on the water for about 6 to 8 hours every day and averaged about 30 miles of travel.
Yeah, it was one of the things I was going to ask is what an average, how long you would travel on an average day. I remember in the documentary you said one day it was 11 and a half hours.
that was a long day.
These Hobie kayaks with the Mirage drive, the pedal drive, I mean, they really are. I'm going to admit, I've been wanting to try one of these for a long time. I've never actually sailed one of these, but I know the pedal drives are really powerful. I mean, it turns your pedaling into a lot of propulsion. But I still, even, as you say, you only spent about 30% of the time pedaling. That still seems like a lot. And was that really difficult, challenging in the beginning, just having to pedal so much, or was that something you were really already prepared for when you started the trip?
I definitely was somewhat prepared in that, I more so before than I am now, but I was a fairly regular runner. And so, I was running 2 to 4 times a week and was building up some of those muscles. But even with that, the kind of position that you sit in for the pedaling uses a very unique set of muscles. And no matter how much you prepare, you're definitely going to be sore. But at the same time, it's a fairly low impact pedaling. And so, as long as you can kind of like muster your way through the first couple of weeks, you get used to it. And, it definitely, was not the easiest right off the bat for the long pedaling days, but you also get into a rhythm pretty easily. The one of the fun things that I had with my trip is actually I had a GPS tracker with me, and so on the project website you could actually follow where I was. I had about a 10-minute delay, so you could follow me online, and I also would send through the GPS. I would send satellite messages to my parents and my partner, being like, "Hey, I'm starting the day," and then I get to the end of the day and text them, "Hey, I'm done for the day." But those points would also allow you to see what my average moving speed was. And that was something my dad was fascinated by, that particularly once I got into the trip, about a month in, I basically just became a machine in that I had like the same average speed for days on end. It was about 2.7 miles per hour. It was always that no matter what. And so, you just kind of get into your pace of things, and you just kind of, on the great days, it's, lovely. And on others, you just kind of put your head down and just pedal, and eventually it'll be over.
Yeah, I can only imagine like doing that kind of consistent exercise all the time. You've got to see changes and build muscles. And I'm going to take a risk here because you're either going to find this really funny or you're going to be horribly offended. I'm going to take the chance. I can just picture you like pulling up to a dock, and sitting there in your kayak and like normal upper body, and then standing up and having these like Arnold Schwarzenegger legs and like stepping on the dock and the whole dock shakes. I don't know why I got that image, but just imagining, did you notice, like, by the time you were done with the trip, did you feel like you were in very different, I imagine must have felt like you were in very different physical condition from when you started?
I was in hugely different physical shape by the end of the trip. By the end of the trip, I had lost probably 15 pounds. And in that time, also gained a ton of muscle. And the thing with the pedaling is it's actually not so much like a leg exercise as it is like a lower body exercise. And you can kind of change the nice thing with these Hobie Adventure Islands is they also have a pretty adjustable seat system. So you can kind of change how your position is. And, I had it set up that it was like mostly a like, upper leg and lower abdominal muscle setup. And so for me, those muscles got much more refined by the end of the trip. But, my arms like basically stayed the same. They didn't get scrawny. They didn't get bigger. They just kind of like were the same. But like, from my chest below, like saw a huge change.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. What was the most memorable reaction that you had from someone you met on the trip when you either just pulled up in this kayak with all this equipment on it, or when somebody found out what you were actually doing? What was the most memorable reaction?
Ooh, there's so many. And also my memory is starting to fade on me a couple of years post trip, but definitely, some of the ones that come to mind were often when I was coming into marinas, because to dock at a marina, oftentimes you have to schedule things ahead of time. You have to kind of book your slip. And marinas, for those who don't book boats and marinas, which is not a lot of people, is you actually don't book a slip. You book a certain number of feet on a dock. And so, oftentimes when I would call into marinas, been like, hey, can I, reserve space on your transient dock for whatever it is tomorrow night? And usually the basic questions is like, how long is your boat? And be like 16 feet. And they're like, 16? Like, yes, 16. They're like, do you need power? Like, the 240 volt, like they would use like on an RV. Do you need power? No. Do you need water? No. Do you need pump out? No. They're like, what kind of boat are you? And I'm like, it's a sailing kayak. And they're like, and you need to dock? Yes. And they're like, all right. I mean, sure, fine, come on. And it was hilarious to kind of pull into the marina to kind of see the reaction. Some of them were like, this is so cool. Others are like, you're taking up dock space that we could be making more money on. And, some of my favorite reactions, I think to the marina that when I pulled into New Smyrna Beach Marina, which is down in near Cape Canaveral, Florida. And I actually interviewed one of the deckhands there, John. But when I pulled in and, you go to radio in and you're like, oh, hey, I'm on my way in. They're like, are you the one in the red boat? I'm like, yes, that's me. And, they're like, I've never seen something like this before. This is so cool. And then even more so when then the dock manager, learned about my project and my story, they're like, oh, hey, like, this is so cool. Like, you don't have to pay your docking fees tonight. Like, this is just such a cool story. And those were some of my, favorite opportunities and chances is when those people found this as a cool opportunity, not an annoyance. And it was an opportunity for us to also kind of connect with each other and kind of share some stories along the way.
Yeah. So in your film, you're interviewing different people that you spoke with along the way. Was that all planned ahead where you had, you knew who these people were and you made plans to talk to them and you said, hey, I'm going to be there around this date and I'd love to talk with you? Or was that all just like spontaneous where you would stop somewhere and find someone to talk to?
So it depends. Throughout the film, I've got about 8 or 9 interviews with people, and the whole ethos of these interviews is trying to talk to people about, how they think and, talk about the idea of climate change. And so, when trying to find those kinds of people, some of them were definitely pre-planned, doing some networking, some calling and working my network of people that I know, of like, hey, I'm doing this trip. Who should I talk to? And so there's definitely like, some of the ones I think about is, the first interview in the film, Julieta Rodrigo. She works at the Clio Institute, or used to. She's actually not at the Clio Institute anymore. But she worked at the Clio Institute, which is all about, activating young people to work and promote climate education and climate action. And so, after connecting with them, they're like, oh, yes, absolutely. I will be down here at this time to do this interview. Others are like, oh, I might be there in this time frame of a week. Are you available? I'll let you know a little bit more in time in advance. Others were, I would meet one person in a town and then they would be like, oh, I think you need to talk to this person in the next town that you get to. And, I will call them and help set up something. Those were some of my favorites because then they would like meet me at the marina and they're like, oh, hey, this person was telling me so much about you. I'm super excited. That was great. There were other times that, I would show up into a town and be like, I kind of want to interview someone here. I kind of want to talk to someone, but I have no connections. And, the great story I have with that is I was coming up through Florida and it was technically the last island in Florida, which is Amelia Island and Fernandina Beach, right at the very, very northern end of Florida. And I pulled into the island and had no connections on the island, but I knew that, there were some things happening on the island, mostly because it's a barrier island. It's part of the Sea Island chain of, formerly enslaved Africans. So there's this like interesting relationship on the island. Then there's also a manufacturing plant on the island, but they also have this like super green promotion PR campaign. It's super interesting. And so I actually went to the visitor center on the island and be like, hey, I'm doing this project. I'm looking to talk to people. Who should I talk to? And, there's two lovely ladies at the front desk. I'm like, oh, we know exactly who you should talk to. And you need to talk to our former mayor. I'm like, cool. Where can I find him? I'm like, oh, he's the bartender down the street. And I was like, the bar down the street? And like, oh yeah, it's it's the community place just down the street. And I was like, all right, who should I ask for? And, tell me his name. And so I go down there, and lo and behold, I walk in, I'm like, hey, I'm looking for so-and-so. And they're like, oh yeah, that's him down the bar. And, I grabbed a drink, and we ended up sitting and chatting for like, a half an hour on, what is it like being a mayor of, a small beach town, and trying to balance the different things of the politics of the island, but also at the same time, like dodging certain questions about, some of the more environmental impacts of having a manufacturing plant on the island, because it also is a major economic benefit to the island. So it was fascinating.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next topic that I was hoping to ask about, which is, climate change, as we all know, can be a controversial topic and sometimes a hot button topic. Maybe it would be nice if it wasn't, but, it ends up being that. So I remember you describing this trip at some point. It was maybe something I read, or actually in the film itself, where you said that your goal was to make this trip to talk with people about climate change. And I found that interesting, the way you phrase it, not like bring attention to climate change, but more like just have conversations with people about it. And I remember another, statement that came out, I think it's even right at the end of the film, is we're not as divided as we think we are. And that was a really strong theme that I found. And probably, I think, there's so many interesting parts of the film, but one of the most interesting parts of the film is how that message came out. The idea that we have so much common ground on these issues, maybe more than we realize, especially more than we realize if we're paying attention to social media and some of the other sources of information that we have. I think the one thing I'm curious about is, what would you say are maybe like the three top things that you find people agree about when it comes to climate change?
I'm glad you gave me three. So definitely, like, the main ones that I think about are, some of them are not always like directly related to climate change, but are like kind of tangentially related. Pollution. Everyone agrees that pollution is bad. No one's going to say that pollution is like, it's fine, because, and it comes in all sorts of forms, whether it's plastic pollution or chemical pollution or, air pollution, water pollution. Everyone agrees that pollution is bad. Now, people may not agree at like to what degree bad it is, but they might all agree that it's bad. So pollution is one. Another one is thinking about hurricanes. But even within hurricanes, it's, can be a little dicey, because hurricanes and tropical storms can be hit or miss. That, there are some places that haven't been hit by a hurricane in 30 years and like, it's fine. But, when you talk with people about the fact that we're getting more storms, that's pretty hard to refute, just in general across the entire country and in our world, that we're getting more storms and then potentially, more stronger storms. But, I'd consider that kind of a loose, not a super strong second one. The third one is heat. That's a pretty irrefutable one that a lot of people have talked to, especially as I was kind of finishing up the trip, June and July. They're like, it's hot and it's not used to being this hot. And, the flip side of that is also the winters are not as cold as they used to be, especially down in Florida. That I talked to several people who had spent their entire lives in Florida, and, Captain John, who I talked with in Palm Beach, Florida, he spent his entire life in the Palm Beach area. And he's like, we used to get snow on very rare occasions, but, we got it from time to time, where we might have a little frost, and we haven't had that in 20 years. But, definitely pollution is usually where I would start a lot of these conversations, because that's like a physical thing that people can see. And that's usually where a lot of people can start. It's the kind of intangible things that are always hard to get unanimous agreement upon.
So it sounds like there is a lot of agreement that noticeable changes have been happening, noticeable changes in the weather, things like temperatures and hurricanes. And then, like you said, pollution, the tangible thing that I think that, yeah, it definitely makes sense that people living in coastal communities would be concerned about that. It sounds like there's also some degree of agreement that this is a problem and that something should be done about that. Does that sound accurate, or is there maybe still a lot of disagreement about that?
So yeah, that absolutely is kind of the right way to be thinking about it. That overall, a lot of people I talked with agreed that something is happening, and maybe we should do something about it. Where we started to get varying opinions is like how much of it is caused by humans, how bad is it going to get, and how much should we do something about it, or even do we have the capacity to even be able to do something about it. And that was a very unanimous thing of like, are things changing? Yeah, probably, but how bad and if it's our fault and what we should do about it are usually where things started to differentiate.
What is one thing about the trip that surprised you the most?
This is the thing that I'm going to say here is something that took me a while to kind of figure out. And I didn't really figure it out until kind of the end of the trip and a little bit after. Some of the pushback that is happening within the climate change sphere that is coming from kind of the older generation X and younger in baby boomer generation that I didn't really expect at first, but I guess kind of makes sense is, and this came out in the interview with Roger Pickney in the film, is that so much of their parts of the environment in their life is better for the people that were born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. They have lived through the passage of the Clean Air Act. They've lived through the passage of the Clean Water Act. They've seen the benefits of the Endangered Species Act. The banning of DDT. All of these environmental protections that have now actually seen the rebound of the environment in a lot of ways. In their lives, in a lot of ways, it's better. The water is cleaner, the air is cleaner. There's more fish in these areas. There's more crabs. There's more dolphins. There's more osprey. There's more eagles. And so at a local scale, in a lot of ways, things are better. But that's the problem in some ways with climate change, is that it is at such a big scale, a global scale, that for a lot of people, it's nearly impossible to wrap your head around the fact that humans are just single species have negatively affected an entire planet. And so it's much easier, an easier way to wrap your head around the benefits that have happened in your area rather than thinking out on a global scale.
Yeah, it is hard for us to think in such large scales, right? And it's easier for people to see what is right in front of them. It is, I want to say, encouraging to hear that people are really aware that things are better with some of this legislation that's been passed to protect the environment. And, I think even being my age, I've grown up maybe not seeing the before so much and just benefiting from the after. But yeah, that is, and I know that came up in a couple of conversations. I remember in the film, at least one person mentioning that and the benefits they've seen from that. So I remember, when you arrived at the end of the trip, it was the last day, and you seemed really excited. You remember at one point you were saying, "What a trip," just this big exclamation. How did you feel about the trip coming to an end? Was it, I'm just going to leave it at that. How did you feel about the trip coming to an end on that last day, or as you stepped off the boat knowing that it was over?
Coming to the end of a trip, it had several phases of the emotions around it, but more than anything, I had this like feeling of overwhelming accomplishment, and that it more than anything was a show to myself that I can do something that I can put my mind to, especially with the project, having to be put on hold due to the start of the pandemic in 2020 and restarting it in 2021. It really was incredible to kind of go across a finish line that I had arbitrarily set for myself. Other than like that is technically the where I put the finish line is technically mile marker 0 of the Intercoastal Waterway. But I could have set that goalpost anywhere, but I decided for myself that I'm going to put this start point and put this end point, and I'm going to get here from point A to point B by myself. And the particular emotion at the end of that is really that personal success of I did it, I pushed myself, and I got there. But then there's kind of the follow-up waves of emotion afterwards of like I got here by myself, but I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the support of the family that I have and the friends that I have, and the community that I've built over the years. But also at the same time, it sets in a few days later, and really kind of a longer feeling of you get to the end, and then you also get this like overwhelming like pit of emptiness. There was also some really dark places that you end up after a big trip like that, because for 3 months, I knew exactly what I was going to do every day. I was going to get up, I was going to pack up, I was going to paddle, I was going to sail, I was going to talk to people, I was going to interview, then I was going to sleep. That was what I did for 3 months straight. And then when you get to the end of a trip like that, you then start to really struggle with, what am I doing today? What am I going to do tomorrow? And, it was helpful for me that, I had things of like, I have to edit a film now. And like that kept me going, in some ways, but at the same time, like the physical side of that physical exhaustion was something that I really became used to, and not being able to push myself like that as often, was hard for a while for me to kind of get over. And that was some of the coaching that I got with some of the people that I had met along the way and friends that I'd had, that they kind of coached me that like, when you get to the end of a big trip like this, like it's going to be exciting at first. And then like, it's okay to feel like total crap for weeks. And it's just something that you have to move through. But at the same time, finding ways to, put yourself to work to find things to do, so you don't just sit around and mope about what you don't have anymore, and finding joy in the new parts of your life.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Everything you're saying about that, about your experience of the trip coming to an end. I think it's maybe counterintuitive to some people, because you would think even as much as you might enjoy the trip itself, people would think there's some aspect of it where you would say, oh, I'm just so glad to be off that boat. I'm so glad to have all the comforts of, normal life on shore. But yeah, it makes total sense that there would be certain things that we're missing, that you become used to in an adventure like that.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. Like the be able to have, hot water at a minute's notice. Great. The idea of, a hot shower whenever I wanted it. Fantastic. Having a microwave and like all the necessities of home and air conditioning, those were all amazing, but at the same time, when you spend that much time outside, you also realize how much of that you don't necessarily need to be happy and thrive at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. It makes sense. Maybe along those lines of what you were talking about, or maybe something different. What after the trip, after returning from that trip and returning to a, normal life on shore, what are you most grateful for or appreciative of?
Ooh, interesting. I'm really appreciative of air conditioning. That was something that, you get used to out there, and then you come back in and you're like, oh, this is nice. One of the things that I really appreciated when I came back was having those that I loved close to me again. I think that was something that I really appreciated. I had an incredible support network along the whole trip, that, I would call them and they'd be cheering me on. Um, but coming back and being able to spend time with, those close to me, was probably one of the most rewarding things coming back after being gone for so long.
I was about to say I might not include this in the podcast, but maybe I will. It's in a lot of conversations I've had recently with different people, both on the podcast and outside of the podcast, about different topics. And it's interesting how so many of the conversations always come back to connection and how people value connection with other people in their lives. It's just interesting how often that's popped up in the last year or so of different conversations with different people. It makes sense that, being out on an adventure by yourself like this, that's something you would appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, connection takes so many different forms. And I could talk about connection all day, because it's like, I think so important, especially when it comes to the idea of climate change and how do we talk about it, what do we do about it, is it comes down to connections because, in of itself, climate change is a pretty intangible concept in a lot of ways. I mean, how does a single species, terraform an entire planet? And, how do we talk about that? And that's through connection. And I think a big part of connection is storytelling. And that's kind of what this film is so important to me, is the idea of storytelling, and that everyone is a storyteller and everyone has their own way of telling their stories, and no one is a better storyteller than another, in my opinion. It's just, you just haven't found your story to tell yet. And that's what I hope with this, this film, and, the continuing work that I do is, to put out work to also kind of be a permission slip for people to go out and find their own connections and find their own stories. Don't go do what I did. I did my kayaking trip. Go do your kayaking trip, but don't do the exact same kayaking trip that I did. And, when it comes to climate change, I don't think we're kidding ourselves, to say that we're not scared. I'm scared. I'm scared of the future that is predicted to happen to our world. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should not try and do something. What's the harm in trying? We are one of the most intelligent species that, our planet has ever seen. And we have done this to our planet, and even to the people that say that, we haven't done this to our planet. All right, then why not have us be the leaders in fixing it? And I think that is how we're going to fix climate change is, we're not going to get everyone on the same page on how we got here, but hopefully we can get everyone on the same page on what we do about it. And that comes through the connections that we make, that, the interviews in the film that you see, like on the recorded part, are usually more than halfway through of my conversation with these people, because the way that we get these authentic responses in storytelling is to be vulnerable on both sides. So, it starts with me telling a story of myself, of, how I got to where I am, what I like doing, and asking some questions like, well, what do you like to do? Oh, you like fishing? I like fishing. Let's talk about fishing for a little bit. Because connections also ultimately come back to trust, and people aren't going to trust each other if they don't know each other. And so, it takes a little bit of extra effort, but at the same time, I had some of the most incredible conversations with people that I disagreed vehemently politically with, but at the same time, we were both sailors, or, we're both fishermen, or, we both love to cook. And, that's where we can find our pieces of connection. And if once you can find those pieces of connection, you can, start to expand the conversation into larger topics. And that's what I hope this film can show to people, that, climate change is not a single button issue topic, but it involves so many different things. And that hopefully the more conversations we have, things like climate change will just start to show up in everyday conversation. The more we talk about it, then hopefully the more we'll do about it too.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that I see coming out of this project, this adventure you went on, and coming through in the film too, is the capacity that we do have to find common ground and to find common things that we can talk about and understand and agree on. And it seems like if there's one thing that's going to help us survive and thrive, it's that, right? It's our ability to do that. That's really, we're coming into an age where our survival will really depend on that more than anything.
Yeah.
Well, Will, I appreciate your time and I appreciate you sharing all these stories with us. I have one question that I have been asking people at the end of podcast episodes that I'd like to ask you that same question right now. What is your dream right now?
Ooh, what is my dream right now? Right now, my dream is to hope and work towards a future where the threshold to creative endeavors is as low as possible. Because, as I was saying earlier, everyone has their story to tell, and oftentimes there are human and societal imposed barriers to creating those stories. And whether that's through education or outreach or finances, whatever it is, my dream is a world where everyone has the capacity to tell their stories without barriers standing in their way.
Excellent. That's a wonderful dream. Are there any links, web pages, socials, anything you would like to share with people where they can learn more about this project or anything else that you're doing that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so you can find links to all of my things on my website, willthefourth.com. That's Fourth. willthefourth.com. That's got links to both of my documentaries that I've produced, as well as writing pieces that I've done, links to my socials, and other places that you can find me on the internet, because we live in that age where we're all over the place. But that is my main place, where things are posted and things are linked to.
All right. Awesome, Will. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for sharing all this.
Absolutely, Scott. Thanks so much for having on, and glad to revisit some of these stories and memories.
The film that Will made about this journey is called Connected by Water. As we mentioned, that film is available on YouTube. It's a little over an hour long, and I personally think Will did a great job with it. I enjoyed watching it, and I definitely recommend it if it piques your interest at all. You can find a link to the YouTube video on Will's website, willthefourth.com, and that link is in the show notes. If you're anywhere near the Outer Banks of North Carolina, you can watch Connected by Water at the Outer Banks Environmental Film Festival on November 2nd through the 4th, 2023. Have you been planning your own adventure? Maybe you want to make a film, or maybe climate change is important to you and you want to do something about it. If you're someone who has great ideas, the challenge sometimes lies in turning those ideas into a reality. Maybe you have trouble finding time, or maybe the thought of actually doing this thing that you've dreamed about doing seems a little overwhelming. I love helping people turn their dreams and ideas into actions. And I especially like helping people who want to do something meaningful and exciting. I love talking with people who dream big. Visit my website, scottmillercoaching.com, to learn about the work that I do as a personal and professional development coach. Part of the problem is often just finding time to work on a project or an idea. And if that's something that you struggle with, I run a free 1-hour online time management workshop every month. There's a link on my website, scottmillercoaching.com, to register. If you're wondering what the dogs are doing, they are ridiculous. We have these two pretty much identical dog toys. And last night, Maple had one of these toys. And Bug really wanted it. So I gave the other toy to Bug, the almost identical one. But that wasn't good enough because Bug wanted the one, of course, that Maple had. And it was just really funny watching Bug get all huffy about it. Before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to Allie605, who left a really nice review for us on Apple Podcasts. Allie wrote, "I really enjoyed the first episode of Creating a Cooler World. Scott and his guests dug into a fascinating topic, decreasing the carbon footprint of the skydiving industry. And they did so in a way that kept me, a non-skydiver, engaged. This was a fun and educational listen, and I'm excited for the next episode." So Allie605, thank you very much for your kind words and for that kind review. And we hope you enjoyed this episode too. That's all we have for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. Take care.